So time to wrap up. Send emails to Jessica at the email address up there for your presentation. If you didn't get the technology part, that's okay. You can still report out. If you're waiting for the rest of your group to come back from the bio break, hopefully they will filter back in as we get started. And we are going to have time for crosstalk between tables. So I would recommend that each table do their 3-minute presentation. And we will have about another minute if there's anyone else in the table that wants to augment what was being said by the rapporteur. And then we'll move to other tables. And then after everybody reports out, we will do a bit of a crosstalk so that all the ideas in the room can ferment, and people with other kinds of expertise from elsewhere in the room can comment on the things that were said by each of the tables to try to build the most integrated research slash resource building agenda for the, what was the name of the group? The NAP that has this $10 billion. So we can make this $10 billion go most efficiently and as far as possible. So let's go in order. The first table on our list is actually the one that I was sitting at, immunotoxicology. So Sarah, I know you're the rapporteur, and do we have your slide? Can we? You just sent it. Do we have Sarah's slide from the immunotoxicology? We don't have any slides yet. Is that because it is in the ether of the of trying to get the ether of email? Sarah, you did send it? Did you send it? It is a very beautiful slide. Okay. All right. Well, Sarah, if you could start, and then it will appear. We are promised. We'll start with another table. But they don't have any emails. Do you have? You got John. Okay. So perhaps start with that table. John, what table are you? Environmental change. Okay. All right, so can we start with environmental change report out? Okay, it looks like it's coming up on this screen, but here we go. All right, so there you go. Okay, so the first report out table is environmental change. Go for it. You have, why don't you come up here, Maureen?
We gave new meaning to it takes a team to do this, and it did take a team. The team, the names you see there, Gina, Catherine, Clifford, Thomas, Lisa, and John. And so we were allowed one slide, and I'll walk you through the slide. The first notion is it's about people, and that's in the inner circle. The second is that there is a whole lot of research to be done in the disciplinary sciences, so whether it's in environmental health and infectious disease, but we limited ourselves to those research questions from the disciplinary sciences that were directly related to the complex interactions of those sciences. And then overarching to that is the so what question. So how does policy and the social context influence the implementation of those questions? And so here are some of the questions in 3 buckets that influence, that really define the complex interaction and therefore our research agenda. The first one is that we noticed that the right statisticians aren't in the room. They weren't in the room yesterday and they aren't in the room here. Because if we had the right statisticians in the room, no offense to the current statisticians who are here, obviously, we would be able to be more thoughtful and use the power of big data and data science. We need that because without predictive modeling, we won't be able to answer the questions that deal with complex interactions. We need them because we have to go beyond the nonlinear effect P at 0.01 kind of statistics. Because we need to look at multiple stressors. We need them because we need to really focus on the buffering effects rather than just looking at means. We must look at extremes and not only just the mean. Otherwise, we won't pick up the small effects. And we need those statisticians because we need to account for the lag time that occur both in climate change as environmental disasters. So that's our first major area of research. The second major area of research is community resilience. The National Academies will come out very soon with a report on measuring community resilience. I was fortunate enough to be a member of that report. But one of the key things that we discussed at our table where there is more research needed is the influence of the hum in the background. The hum in the background are those stressors that often are not chemical in nature, not environmental in nature, not infectious disease in nature, that do affect susceptibility. If there are psychosocial stressors, stress, and other areas, community violence, that do affect the vulnerability and susceptibility of the populations at this intersect of exposure to both environmental change and infectious disease. A very foundational notion, actually, that came up at our table is the press versus pulse perturbation. The press perturbation are those aspects that influence the hum, the stressors that are already in the society, where you already have a disaster of sorts. And in our world, we call those slow-moving shocks and stressors. They're shocks and stressors nevertheless. And then on top of those come the pulse perturbation. That's that hurricane, that's the technological disaster, on top of what already is a level of susceptibility in that community. And therefore, in those communities, you may not need a Category 4 hurricane. You may need just a Category 1 to put that community over the hump in terms of effects. It is clear from what we discussed yesterday and our team today that we can't do this, and you've heard this morning also from Neil, without the social sciences. So social scientists are key to what we are embarking on. And then an equally important notion at our table was the distribution of consequences. The consequences aren't equal. This is not the impact on human health of the interaction of the often cumulative effect of environmental change, exposure to environmental change, and infectious disease is not equal. There's no equal opportunity here. The third major bucket is on food and food supply. Nutrition, however it is influenced, directly is related, of course, to the status of your immune system and therefore the status of your susceptibility. Things like the entire spectrum from the soil microbiome and the influence of the soil microbiome in nutritional effects are important. And I'm getting the signal here, the hook, so I'll be quicker. But key to the food piece is the indirect effect. If you want an R01 and you don't have a health outcome, you won't get it. And so can we elevate the indirect effect at the same level of scientific inquiry as we do a specific health outcome? In terms of time frame, from the 0 to 5 year, we propose to focus on the indirect effects. We propose to focus on the specific questions such as mold, but we particularly have perhaps a daring notion is that we take fictional out of the books that you've gotten and make the National Agency for Peoples and Planet a reality. Because separating biomedical and non-biomedical sciences, ecological sciences, is not helping us clearly to address the question. And without the last part of the circle, as you see, without policy preparedness, if we elevate policy preparedness at the same level as we get, food supplies in after a disaster, we'll be better off. Thank you.
So there will be time for crosstalk back with Maureen and her table. But now if we can move to immunotoxicology, table 1. Sarah?
Hi, guys. So we are envisioning our proposal as kind of a tiered approach that would progress over the 15 years of the funding and would involve a lot of self-assessment back across those tiers. So not just forward movement up the tiers, but kind of self-reference back as well. So the base of our proposal involves like 4 prongs, essentially. The first one being screening. So in immunotoxicology, there's kind of we're lacking an understanding of what are the ideal assays to use to measure challenges in host immunocompetence. So we would want to screen various assays, calibrate them, and verify them, and find which ones are the best assays to use for various cell populations that are salient and important for a variety of infectious diseases. We're also, the next prong would be looking at a widespread exposure assessment. So we want to determine what doses are actually relevant. And through our screening process, we would be looking at dose responses and determining what dose at which immunocompetence is actually affected. So when does it become relevant? And through our exposure assessment, what populations are most vulnerable. The next prong would be looking at attributable risk. So as Maureen just said, this isn't just about the exposures that we have that are exogenous. This is also about looking at things like stress and things that are a little bit harder to measure and not quite as straightforward. And also looking at multinomial exposure. So, we might be interested in arsenic, let's say, but there are nutritional deficiencies and different single nucleotide polymorphisms that vary throughout different populations that are really important for determining what people's risk will be. And then the last prong would be looking at host immunocompetence. So again, looking at single nucleotide polymorphisms and other measures of individual immunocompetence. Also, life stages are critically important. As most of us know, pregnant women and neonates, as well as the elderly, are typically the most susceptible and the most susceptible to infectious diseases. So after establishing doses that are relevant for various populations around the world, as well as those doses that at which immunocompetence is actually affected, we would then move on to testing and modeling this. We're talking about animal testing, human testing, in terms of not actually testing on people, but testing on ex vivo tissues from people, blood samples, and making sure that our models, both animal and cell line, are actually relevant to what we see in a human population. So again, that goes back to that self-assessment. So constantly making sure that what we're utilizing is relevant. And then we also talked about the importance of in silico methods and high throughput modeling. So this would be really useful, so right now our capacity in most labs is to look at one chemical at a time. And if you're really lucky and you're really ambitious, looking at a small mixture of chemicals. The benefit of in silico is being able to not only determine what the potential toxicity of a chemical might be just from its chemical structure and properties, but also to be able to model a variety of exposures that we would have determined from the base of our proposal. Things like attributable risk and host immunocompetence. So that would be our middle tier, and then as we near the end of our proposal timeline, we would have more human interventions. And then again, of course, very important with human interventions is having measures of assessment of those interventions. You can't just go out into the field, do something, call it a day, and say that it was great. You have to have measures of was it effective? And then if it wasn't, or if there were drawbacks, go back to the drawing board, move backwards in the tiers, and determine ways that you could improve upon those interventions and keep going back out into the community. I'd like to throw it back to my team at this point and see if you guys have anything that you'd like to add.
So I think immunotoxicology is good for right now, but we're happy to engage with the rest of the group in further research building discussions. Let's move on to table 3, which was table 2, which is epidemiology. So do we have epidemiology slides? We do. Thumbs up. And we have Lisa. Thank you.
Okay, the first slide was for me to read. Second slide's for everybody else. So our group covered a lot of ground, as you might expect. Really, we came out with a few main priorities for the research in the epidemiological area. The first, I think, one of the things that we talked about was the fact that while there are disease surveillance systems widely available through various areas in the world, the ability to link those with environmental surveillance systems, which are have some capacities in for some types of pollution, but maybe less so for others, is very limited. And so, strengthening and developing and expanding and integrating surveillance systems for both environmental factors and infectious disease will support a wide range of research. So we think that that's an important priority for the research funding in this area. We wanted to talk about. I've lost my thing here. We think that it's very important that, to the extent that the immunotoxicology community is developing a variety of assays and markers that allow us to investigate hypotheses about relationships between exposures and immune system outcomes, that bridging that to clinical outcome and the clinical implications of those markers is very, very important. And so that will take an integrative and cross-disciplinary research effort to ensure that that happens. We think that it's very important to expand devote some of this funding to expanding current large-scale studies that are already in place that may or may not have all of the funding and focus that they need to really look at environmental factors in infectious disease. So things like the ECHO program, the USN Haynes program, if there are specific components that could be added and funded to strengthen the ability to do this sort of research, epidemiologic research. The All of Us program, which is now collecting biospecimens and doing genetic profiling, but then also potentially has the opportunity to look at outcomes and also particularly chemical exposures from the biospecimens. The DoD Serum Repository and their medical records with their individuals who go all over the world and encounter all kinds of different both vector-borne disease and also chemical exposures. All of those are opportunities to take funding and enhance and expand to answer the types of questions we're interested in here. And finally, modeling. Here we're talking about system sort of modeling where we're looking at being able to integrate information about exposure disease relationships as well as societal factors that allow us both to predict the response to changes such as increasing urbanization or climate change and predict potential impacts on disease occurrence, but also to identify potentially modifiable factors that could mitigate or reduce impacts and test those in models and then allow us to identify options for interventions that we may want to try in the real world as we address changes, emerging diseases, and expanding ranges of diseases, for example. So all of those, that sort of system modeling, we think is a very important component which integrates epidemiologists and other groups. So all of this should be identified, should be focused towards identifying actionable factors to improve health outcomes.
Very efficient and very well laid out. Anything else from epidemiology table for completeness? Well, again, more things can come up later, but that's great. And now for the disease ecology research table. We have their slides. And yes, come on up.
So my apologies, we have 2 slides, and we don't have any nifty graphics. So we failed on those 2 counts, and I apologize profusely. So first we had a discussion to define exactly what does disease ecology mean. And we looked up that disease ecology is basically the ecological study of host pathogen interactions in environments, considering and taking into account evolution. So taking that into account, then, we tried to determine which of the research questions would give us the most bang for the buck, if you will. And we divided the environmental exposures to 2 factors. One is biotic, host resistance models, pathogen ecosystems, understanding that, and those biotic exposures are influenced by the abiotic modifiers, such as the heavy metals, the toxins, the pesticides, what have you. So that kind of formed the core of our pressing research questions. And we would start primarily with the local regional model, looking at not only human communities, but the animals that live within those communities, whether they be the companion animals that share our homes, livestock, or wildlife, within the surrounding ecosystems, the milieus in which people live. And the scaling would go from molecular to understand the mechanisms, eventually up to the global. And this would require multidisciplinary input, including social scientists, very important, veterinarians, ecologists, epidemiologists, molecular biologists, bacteriologists, virologists, geologists, entomologists, and medical professionals. Regarding the multidisciplinary input, the next set of questions that would need to be resolved within the field before implementing it into a multidisciplinary effort, that would require standards development so that all these different fields then can talk with a common language. Because every field has their own lingua franca, we wanted to be able to develop standards for everybody to communicate. So that would include standard operating procedures, common languages within and across the disciplines, development of technology, common technology, methodology, and endpoints. And the time frame, the focus for the initial 5 years would be to develop this common standards, framework, methodology, and then building upon that in the next 6 to 10 years would then go about answering the research questions, hopefully develop new disciplines, and in over 10 years, the development of a whole new field. And finally, in terms of the impact of the decisions, the key question then is looking at jobs and the economy versus the preservation of the environment and ecosystems. And the question is, does this have to be an antagonistic relationship, or can we develop a mutually beneficial relationship? Can economic development complement environment and ecosystem preservation to reduce the risk of biotic environmental exposures? So look forward to discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. And now for Table 5, convergence, transdisciplinary work. Who do we have? Do we have slides for convergence? Yes. They did. Okay, so they will be appearing. And, okay, we have a speaker, rapporteur. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm here on behalf of the whole group, and we were tackling sort of the key barriers to developing and sustaining the kinds of multidisciplinary collaborations that have just been proposed. So those were amazingly ambitious research agendas. How is it that we implement those? So we have a very long list of barriers, only some of which I'm going to do here. And these are sort of a prioritized list of the things that we came closest to trying to come up with some potential solutions for. So one of the key barriers to developing these kinds of partnerships is time. Right? It takes a long time to learn each other's language, to build the effective partnerships. That's just within the research community. And then if we want to be able to translate the outcomes of this research to the public and to communities, we need stakeholder engagement, and all of that takes time. Neil did a great job of describing that this morning. We also need time to sequence activities for the projects to happen. So once the partnerships are built, you need to make sure that everything is happening on the right timescale. And then we think a really big gap is how to sustain teams beyond a short-term grant or contract. So a 3 to 5 year project is funded, the time is invested in it, and then how do you bridge to the next one? How do you keep that going in the long run? So we talked a lot about the role of funding that would sustain infrastructure between individual projects, funding to sustain the personnel and the partnerships from the short term through the medium term, and then really thinking about the long term. And we don't have answers for that, but we see the need for it. We also talked about the importance of stewards and champions, particularly in the political realm. So the example came up, I think it was from Keith, that the Fogarty Institute was on the chopping block at one point, and it was partnerships with politicians that made sure that didn't happen. So we need to make sure that we invest in time for those partnerships. There's all sorts of things going on my screen. Here we go. Another component here is leadership and management. So we need individuals who have the vision to think in the long term and to set research agendas like the 4 of you who just presented have done. But then we also need the on-the-ground people who can implement that vision in the short run. And we're not sure those are the same skill sets, so we need to develop leaders who can do both of those things. We also need to be thinking about leadership transitions. So if we're talking about a 20-year time frame, how do we invest in the people who will become the successional leaders? How do we groom today's assistant professors for those leadership positions in the future? We also talked about the differences between, again, thought leadership and potentially the long run, but also the neutral project leadership and the administrative skills to kind of keep things on the ground running, and the ability to keep an eye on these multiple timescales. We also talked about incentives and resources, and here we're thinking particularly about engagement, not only of researchers, but again, of stakeholders, the importance of bringing the right people to the table, and that those incentives didn't always have to be financial. They could take other forms as well. We also talked about effective inclusion of the stakeholders and of the researchers. When we're going through the process of building consensus and developing recommendations, how do you create a safe space for stakeholders to share their ideas and yet be completely transparent about the process? And Neil gave some examples about private versus public conversations with stakeholders so everybody could contribute. And more broadly, we thought about communication within the team internally, outward facing about the team's outcomes, and also at the end of a project, the education to amplify those outcomes. So sharing what's already going on, especially across funders. One of the things we talked about is that there's a lot of people in this room who've never talked to each other before, and realizing the diversity of activities that are out there. So another form of communication is just across the many, many different kinds of projects that are going on, the many kinds of funding efforts that are going on, and how they can work together. Group, what am I forgetting that you'd like to chime in with? We have 57 seconds. Okay, we yield our extra time.
This is amazing so far. I'm learning so much. We are now going to continue on with the implementation of this amazing research agenda into community engagement. So we have slides for community engagement? Yes. We do. And Neil, take it away.
So we'll take your minute because we have 3 slides and no fancy pictures. So for barriers to opportunities, we lumped them together. We talked first about research-driven mechanisms to engage with communities, but the first thing to just remind people of is that the issues we're talking about here, they disproportionately affect communities, especially communities that are vulnerable, that hail from low and middle income countries, that don't really have the empowerment to move forward the research agenda. So how do we place them first? So the one thing is that we as researchers need to better understand what the community needs. So we need to be able to empathize with them. We need to be able to sort of understand their frame of mind, their ways of thinking. We need to spend more time in the communities and with the communities. We need to involve people who do this from a scientific perspective, namely those social scientists. Conversely, we also need to work with the communities to better get them to understand the importance of the research, of the issues that we do study, whether that's through direct education, through novel uses of communication tools, making the issue attractive but also important. There are barriers to sort of doing this. There are disincentives, there's corruption that came up, there's political and business motivations as sort of diverse stakeholders. So how do we recognize that these stakeholder perspectives are important? How do we sort of capitalize upon the divergence that they do bring and sort of then to come to convergent understanding? And that's going to happen with time and understanding. Next slide. So really what we want to do is to get the communities to drive the research. So how do we get community-driven research? They seldom drive research, though what we start to see more and more is that there are community-based approaches such as CBPR, which is bringing to the forefront better the role of the community, the perspectives of the community. We also talked about the other stakeholder groups, and we tend to view certain stakeholder groups through negative lenses. However, I think there are also a lot of great examples, and this came up a lot in the Lancet Commission that a few of us worked on earlier last year on win-win-win solutions, that there are ways to bring aboard the business community, ways to bring aboard regulators with environmental scientists, with biomedical, medical researchers to come up with win-win-win solutions. So we need to do a bit of that. We need to realize that communities are social entities. So again, this is where we need to bring in that social sciences perspective. We also need to get the voices of communities to the highest policy levels. At one level, there are right-to-know legislations and acts in various countries. At another level, in terms of negotiating national and international programs and treaties, Many of us have reflected on the ones that are most effective are ones in which you bring the affected communities to the front lines to talk with the politicians. In terms of communicating, we all communicate, but very few of us are skilled or experts at this. So we need to now sort of look beyond the scientific spheres that we work in and realize that there are experts in communication that we need to bring aboard. And then the last slide is the timeframes that we felt in the near term that we needed to purposely build up programs that help bring communities to the forefront. This would involve things such as archetyping programs together, bringing in communications team, project management teams, and having exchanges to get programs up and running, to get researchers and communities together. And then it's sort of that middle phase from years 5 to 10 in which we can really start to gain some kind of convergent understanding, trust, we can implement, we can iterate, we can reflect. And then ultimately, when you have a researcher community partnership in which the communities are driving the work, you can, in the long term, have sustainability and trust building. So I'll end there. Anything else from our table? Okay, we're done. Thanks.
Riza, education and training.
So the perspectives being shared right now are not those of mine, but those of my table. How about that? Is that a good disclaimer? We had a great conversation about education and training that this slide, I think, depicts, and I only have one slide. And let's start with the two biggest barriers that our table identified, which is the siloed nature and the strict boundaries from both the funding mechanisms and the funding approaches, as well as the departments and the ways that academia is structured with a big drive towards focusing and diving deep into the departments. In particular, even related to rewards from an academic career, where that breadth of exposure going to different types of disciplines oftentimes is seen as being too scattered and not rewarded in order to achieve tenure. You need to dive deeply and deeply and deeply. And then once you do dive deep enough to prove yourself worthy, then and only then are you truly allowed to go horizontally. So these are the types of things that we talked about. And we also see this with regards to even training. So training of grad students, we have a graduate student that was at our table who's in an interdisciplinary program that has interdisciplinary education. But then when they get to the point of picking their advisor, then the advisor hangs on to them and they have to dive very deeply into that one particular area. So it forces people to dive deeply within the core. And Neil brought this up earlier, where you need to have people who are diving deeply into the core. And I think that's really important to have very deep scientists. But we also need to recognize that there are people who work horizontally. And so how do we reward those people? How do we provide them a career path? And how do we provide them the training and education to be able to do that effectively? So that sort of naturally leads to the opportunities. And the opportunities are to have more cross-disciplinary funding. Even looking at NIH, we have NIHS, which provides funding from an environmental health perspective, and then we have NIAID, which is going to provide funding from an infectious disease perspective. So how do we combine these two things together? And then from a training standpoint, problem-based formulation training. How often within graduate studies, or even earlier, do we have the kind of problem-based formulation that would bring social scientists, environmental scientists all to the table, like the example that Neil brought up earlier today? Having training with those types of case studies can be really, really valuable. And also just thinking about training programs. How often in training programs are we taught about project management and project leadership? Core blocking and tackling, components that everyone ends up learning on the job. And my goodness, if we had a couple of case studies and examples in training, it would really accelerate people to be able to do that within their professional careers. The third one is something that was discussed at a breakfast table this morning that was highlighted here, which is another approach is to abolish departments. And there are some academic institutions that have done that. And it is a interesting approach, but it really helps encourage the cross-fertilization that may be necessary for the New World Order. And then finally, about thinking, how do we take this to a global level? How do we take this with regards to community outreach It really does need to be thoughtful and sustainable in order to integrate with the institutions locally at different countries, tailored by country to country, and have it really be established within the institutions within those countries so that they really do adopt these approaches and train at primary and secondary levels, both within those particular countries and also within the national system here for the National Association for People and Planet, which is odd, national and planet together in the same acronym. First thing that we would do is we would change the acronym of the society, because that just seems wrong. Anything that I missed, folks, from the table? Great. Thanks.
I just had a comment from another table. Just finishing 41 plus years in academia, I thought that was a brilliant job, and I really, you really nailed some of our departments actually go back to the Victorian era, and that speaks for itself. So.
Any other? We'll have time for more comments. And table 8, you know who you are, capacity building. We have slides, and we have a speaker. Thank you.
One slide. We'll keep it pretty simple. A lot of this was already covered, which is great. But when we get down to it, it can become a little bit more complex. We took more of a holistic view of our potential barriers and some of the opportunities that might be available to us as we try to achieve our goals and objectives, whatever they may be. So the barriers, we're talking about industry inclusion, which we didn't really talk a whole lot about. It came up yesterday when we're talking about some of the origins of the different pollutants. To include them in our assessment while we're identifying our barriers, particularly those who we're able to trust, as we discussed at our table. Awareness and communication. Community engagement was highlighted. Are all levels, local, national, government levels, aware of the situation? How can we better communicate that to them? How can we communicate the hazards that the local populace is being exposed to? We need to identify the methods by which we can provide those people with the information that they need. Turf wars, conflicting interests. A lot of different organizations, individuals, potentially governments of various nations working within one country, doing different things, and obviously we can have some issues with that. Skilled workforce, that's going to be part of our assessment as we take a look at the existing capacity. But what are the skilled workers? Where are they? And how can we better include them into our plan? The infrastructure, we're talking about people and government elements. So if we have a problem with pollutants, are we able to come up with rules, policies, regulations? Are we able to enforce those policies? Are we able to have a system by which, is there a judicial system in place that is fair? We talked about what the local level is. Some people have their own definition, and to really discuss with the local leaders of a village, a municipality, whatever it may be. Language was discussed. Coordination of efforts. We talked about a lot of different organizations institutions working within one area and each working in a silo. Perhaps developing a more umbrella approach, getting everybody involved, as we've already discussed. Sustainability and continuity. If we're shoveling money at the problem, are the local people going to be able to sustain these projects that we've put in place? How can we make that happen? So obviously, we're going to have some opportunities. We talked about every crisis being an opportunity, and we can see many of that out there today. Initial capability assessments is where we're going to start. It's our opportunity to find out what people might need. And the best way to do that is obviously by asking the people first. Coordinating efforts. Collaboration with people who are already on the ground and those who might be interested in providing similar support. And blended funding. The funding is out there. There's a variety of organizations that we can use, so we're not using only the $10 billion that we have available to us, but allowing and informing the locals, local governments, private sector, what is available to them. So the timeline is basically to identify our barriers, assess the opportunities that are going to be available to us, developing the plan, implementing the plan, continuing the engagement and evaluating how our plan is being implemented, and then continuing continuity and ultimately being able to sustain what we have put in place. Thank you.
So we just have a few minutes for additional thoughts. And one thought that I've had is that this was a $10 billion thought project, but we already have systems like One Health and Global Health, and we have things like NHANES and large infrastructure research projects ongoing. So one topic that we might want to just have out in the broader conversation is how do we take the ideas and the gaps that we've just identified and bring that into the existing structures. Obviously, it may take money that right now hasn't been allocated, but what are the ways that what we now, the systems that we're now working within, how do we bring these ideas into those systems? So does anybody want to just start that conversation for us within the room? What does Global Health, One Health, the various research projects that are going on around the world, how can we augment what's already happening? John.
From my perspective at the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, our infrastructure is still pretty incomplete, I think. You know, I would offer that there are groups of scientists and even some departments and even a program here and there in One Health, but there really is not an institutional research infrastructure to really address the kind of intersectional topics that we have now. So, you know, we've talked a lot about paradigm busting, and I really feel, from my perspective, not speaking in an official capacity, but in a personal capacity as the senior, you know, as a public health person, that to really foster true interdisciplinary research that crosses the ecological sciences and the biomedical sciences, you know, that's why we were pretty into this NAP. I'm not sure we can build it on the you know, I'm not sure that we can co-opt an existing infrastructure without making some pretty significant renovation to it.
Okay. Yeah, we'll stay at the same table, Maureen, and then we'll go back there to Megan.
I support what John said, and particularly caution us to the reason why some of these major new projects aren't really progressing is because we're always trying to back engineer. Let's not back engineer this time. We can use the existing projects or programs as good building blocks, but they can't be the foundation. I think we really have to design first and then see how they fit rather than taking the puzzle pieces and making a puzzle.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I want to support what both John and Maureen said. And from the perspective of maybe a research user of the system, I would agree that One Health is not the example we should look to. One Health will be the beneficiary from this kind of thinking, because we have not yet solved that challenge of how you build the infrastructure and funding system to support interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, and transdisciplinary research.
Okay. So it sounds like we're needing to build something new, and the idea of NAP was a great concept, not only as a conversation starter, but also maybe something that could, we are going to have a write-up of this workshop, both within the National Academy proceedings of this committee, but also potentially as a peer-reviewed publication. So what are the concepts that we want to go forward from what we've done together in the last day and a half? Anything else?
Just an additional context piece. The National Academies, and with a very big emphasis on the S in that, are about to stand up a new innovative committee called the Environmental Health Matters Initiative. Some people in the room may be familiar with it. It went through a pilot phase. It's about to launch as a full committee. And that might be an interesting place to continue a discussion about new ways of doing things. Just a thought.
Right. How do we create a new system, a new infrastructure that is geared, earmarked to solving this global, very important, we've known about infectious disease prevention for a long time, but how do we do a better job of it and make it more infused with the emerging science? Yes, Keith.
Thanks. And just to follow on, and just for a suggestion, is to aggregate existing evidence-based interventions that can have an impact upon in the One Health, planetary health, environmental health sphere. And then along with that, clearly articulate the rate of return for those activities. And then democratizing that knowledge, both at a local, national, and international level, could be something very impactful now.
Right. What works, and how do we, as you say, democratize it and spread it around? Yes.
Yeah, well,
Laura.
I think the National Academies could send an extremely powerful message by developing a National Academy of either One Health or People and Planet. You've got national agency. What about a National Academy that would foster this? And from there, it could have a kind of a chain reaction, if you will, across academia.
Interesting. And I was wondering about that being a national instead of an international NAP. Because which nation are we talking about? But
I would just like to say a couple words about the Environmental Health Matters Initiative. So I think that is what we're trying to achieve, is to try to bring different sectors together and different disciplines together around a number of different issues. I didn't speak up at first because it's not specifically around the issues that we're talking about here. It's including those, but not specifically around those. But I think that is what we're trying to do, as John Balbus said, with this new effort. We're bringing together the expertise that we have access to at our institution, from transportation to engineering to medicine, as well as the traditional biomedical sciences and environmental health experience and strengths. So that's something that we'll be delving into, trying to look at a number of different topics, one at a time, going through those over the next 3-year plan and hopefully further into the future. But that's our current plan, and we'll be looking for ways to do that effectively. We're listening carefully. We have people on the web listening too on how best to do that. We'll be having additional information on our website in the coming weeks on engaging on that particular thing.
Well, that sounds like a ground floor opportunity to get great ideas into this new Academy panel. Yes, Josh.
So thinking a little bit about creating new paradigms for research and training and all that entails also gets back a little bit to, who really needs to be at the table for those kinds of discussions. And I would suggest that this community is a little bit too NIH and with a little bit of NSF kind of driven, and that maybe there's at least two other ways, or two or large groups of partners to think about it. And that is, there's an increasing role for large private philanthropies in this space. So the One Health or Planetary Health has been championed by Rockefeller a little bit, and then Wellcome is picking up the ball in a pretty big way. The Gates Foundation is a major player in infectious disease management, has been a little skeptical of environmental health approaches to date, but there are probably people there who are thinking about it, particularly in the water, sanitation, and hygiene space. Bloomberg has a big interest in public health, particularly these. So there's a series of philanthropies that have, I think, a really critical role in thinking about the long-term sustainability, and it'd be really useful to have players here. Another way to think about this is consortia of funding organizations, and there are a few of these now multinational ones that have taken shape, and one of them is the Global Alliance for Chronic Diseases, the NIH and funding agencies from 13 other countries. These are all government agencies to date, but are, work together, and it's slow and it's complicated and restricted by all the bureaucracies of those agencies. But that's another kind of way to think about the superstructure to enable really transformational kinds of investments in a new paradigm, if you will.
Great. These are all amazing comments. I think we have time for one or two more with permission from the organizers because this is all going to be conversation that continues on into the panel. Yeah.
Just a quick question, just a show of hands. Is there any ecologists in the room? Oh, awesome. Okay, because I was worried about that. Because, when I think about past mistakes and things that have happened, it's always these host-vector interactions that occur. And we think about global warming and different vectors that are interplays of fungi and zoonoses. I really think ecology is a big piece. And I bet you if we talk to some of the ecologists, they'll tell you that a lot of things we don't know or have a hard time predicting are influences on community structure and how it's very local. And even population density factors that affect those populations occur at a very local level. And so I'm just wondering, we talk about interplay and different interactions of multidisciplinary groups. I just want to make sure that we include the ecologists as well, because they have a story to tell. That's
Great.
all.
Okay, well, we are out of time for this section, but I think I learned a lot, as I said, and I think that we have a lot of material to go forward with. And John, do you want to lead us into the panel?